Picture this scenario. You're scrolling through social media and you see your friend from college just bought their first house. Another friend is posting about their European vacation. Someone else is talking about their new car, and you're sitting there wondering how the hell everyone else seems to have their financial life figured out, while you're trying to decide if you can afford both groceries and gas this week. Sound familiar? Well, what if I told you that you're not alone, you're not failing, and there's actually a very specific reason why an entire generation is struggling financially in ways that previous generations simply never experienced? Most people think that millennials and Gen Z are just bad with money, that we spend too much on avocado toast and Starbucks, that we're entitled and lazy and just need to work harder. But here's something that might surprise you. The financial struggles facing people born between 1981 and 2012 aren't about personal failures or poor spending habits. They're about a fundamental shift in the American economy that has made traditional pathways to wealth building virtually impossible for younger generations. If you've ever wondered why your paycheck doesn't seem to go as far as you think it should, or why achieving basic milestones like homeownership feels impossibly difficult, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if it helps clarify what's really happening to an entire generation's financial future. Now, before we dive into the specific numbers that will probably shock you, let me paint you a picture of what normal used to look like. Your parents or grandparents could graduate high school, maybe go to college without taking on crushing debt, get a job that paid enough to support a family, buy a house in their 20s, and build wealth through home ownership and steady employment. This wasn't some fairy tale or exceptional circumstance. This was the standard middle-class American experience for decades, but somewhere between when your parents were young adults and when you became a young adult, something fundamental broke. The economic rules changed, but nobody bothered to update the playbook that everyone keeps handing to younger generations. You're still being told to work hard, get an education, and everything will work out, but the math simply doesn't add up anymore. Here's the reality that most people don't want to acknowledge. 30% of Gen Z reports that financial issues are their primary source of stress. Not relationships, not career uncertainty, not social media pressure, money. And it gets worse. 28% of millennials feel the same way. We're talking about an entire generation where nearly 1 in 3 people wake up every day with money as their biggest worry. But it's not just feelings and anxiety. The numbers tell a story that's even more alarming. 48% of Gen Z and 46% of millennials say they do not feel financially secure. Think about that for a second. Nearly half of people under 40 don't feel financially secure in the wealthiest country in human history. This isn't happening because young people suddenly became irresponsible with money. This is happening because the fundamental economics of building wealth have shifted dramatically against younger generations. The average cost of living has increased by over 28% in just the past decade, while wage growth has remained relatively flat. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. When you break down what's actually driving this cost of living explosion, the picture becomes even more disturbing. Let's start with the single biggest factor destroying young people's ability to build wealth: housing. By spring of 2024, the typical homebuyer was paying roughly $2,800 per month. $2,800. That's more than most people's entire take-home pay. And even though average wages have increased in recent years, they haven't risen nearly as fast as housing costs, pricing entire generations out of homeownership. Just over 26% of Gen Z owned their home in 2024. That number has been essentially flat for 3 years. For millennials, the story is equally concerning. Less than 55% of millennials owned their home last year, basically unchanged from previous years. This stagnation in home ownership rates breaks decades of increasing home ownership among young adults and represents a fundamental shift in American economic opportunity. Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly pretty infuriating. When you compare home ownership rates across generations at the same ages, the pattern becomes undeniable. 32.6% of 27-year-old Gen Z adults owned their home in 2024. When Gen X was 27, 38.4% owned homes. When baby boomers were 27, over 40% owned homes. This isn't just a matter of young people needing more time to save or establish careers. Even when controlling for age, younger generations are significantly less likely to own homes than previous generations were at the same stage of life. But the housing crisis goes deeper than just ownership rates. Mortgage rates started rising rapidly in 2022 after several years of record lows. Weekly average rates went from around 3% at the start of 2022 to 7% by the end of the year, and they've remained elevated between 6 and 7% since then. Over the last 6 years, the income needed to afford a median-priced home in the United States has jumped 70% from about $67,000 in 2019 to $114,000 in 2025. Let me put that in perspective for you. The median household income in America is around $70,000. The income needed to afford a median-priced home is $114,000. This means that the typical American family cannot afford the typical American home. This isn't about wanting luxury or having unrealistic expectations. This is about basic shelter becoming unaffordable for the majority of working Americans. And even renting has become increasingly burdensome. Gen Z spending on rent and utilities outpaces all other generations. Young adults are spending larger percentages of their income on housing than any generation before them, leaving less money available for saving, investing, or building wealth. The inability to purchase homes has far-reaching implications that extend way beyond just having a place to live. Homeownership has traditionally been the primary vehicle for middle-class wealth building in America. Homeowners have about 40 times the wealth of renters. 40 times. When you exclude an entire generation from homeownership, you're not just affecting their housing situation. You're systematically excluding them from the primary mechanism that built middle-class wealth for decades. Consider the case of Tyler, a 33-year-old from Denver whose housing search perfectly captures the reality facing millions of millennials. Tyler started his search a year ago, initially looking at standalone houses. Even something that was a single bedroom, tiny house, he couldn't afford anywhere that he actually wanted to live. Tyler's experience represents millions of young adults who find themselves priced out, not just of ideal homes, but of basic housing in locations where they work and want to build their lives. His year-long search reflects the time and emotional energy that housing costs extract from young adults. Energy that previous generations could dedicate to career advancement, starting families, or building wealth. The fact that even tiny, single-bedroom properties were unaffordable in areas where Tyler wanted to live shows how the crisis has moved beyond luxury housing into the basic starter home market. This forces young adults into impossible choices. Accept longer commutes that eat up time and money. Live in smaller spaces that affect quality of life. Choose less desirable neighborhoods that may impact safety or career opportunities. Or continue renting indefinitely, missing out on the wealth-building opportunity that home ownership represents. Each choice carries significant long-term financial and lifestyle consequences that previous generations simply didn't face. But housing is just one piece of a much larger puzzle that's systematically undermining the financial future of younger generations. The second major factor crushing young people's ability to build wealth is something that previous generations either didn't deal with at all or dealt with on a much smaller scale: student loan debt. And the numbers here are absolutely staggering. 18.5 million millennials have outstanding student loan debt. That's nearly 40% of all student loan borrowers in America. While Gen Z has a slightly lower average debt balance at around $23,000, they represent the second largest group of borrowers, making up over 28% of everyone carrying student debt. And here's the kicker that really shows how this debt is destroying financial opportunity. 84% of Gen Z with student loan debt have put off major investments like buying a home, or starting a business. Think about what that means for a second. More than 8 out of 10 young adults with student loans are delaying the exact activities that build wealth because they're trapped servicing education debt. This isn't just affecting their current financial situation. It's systematically preventing them from taking advantage of the wealth-building opportunities that were available to previous generations. The scope of this crisis is mind-boggling. About 43 million Americans are dealing with federal student loan debt, with an average balance of $38,000. The collective balance exceeds $1.7 trillion. $1.7 trillion. That's more than the entire GDP of most countries, and it's all sitting on the shoulders of people trying to start their adult lives. But the real damage isn't just the total amount. It's what these monthly payments do to young people's ability to make other financial decisions. 50% of borrowers say they contribute less to personal savings or retirement accounts because of student loan payments. Nearly 1 in 6 borrowers are paying $500 or more per month just on student loans. Let me put that $500 monthly payment in perspective. For a typical Gen Z graduate earning $35,000 annually, that payment represents more than 17% of their gross monthly income. When you combine that with housing costs that often consume 30 to 40% of income, these graduates find themselves with almost no financial flexibility whatsoever. That $500 per month over a 10-year repayment period totals $60,000, money that could otherwise serve as a down payment on a home, seed funding for a business, or substantial retirement savings. Instead, it's going to service debt for an education that was supposed to improve their economic prospects. And here's something that will probably make you angry. Gen Z is actually making higher average monthly payments than millennials, despite having lower average debt balances. Gen Z makes an average monthly payment of $300 toward their student loans, compared to millennials who report making an average payment of $200. 36% of Gen Z has paid more than $300 per month, compared to just 18% of millennial borrowers. This suggests that either Gen Z is being more aggressive about paying off their loans, which limits their ability to save for other goals, or they're facing less favorable repayment terms than previous borrowers. Either way, it's constraining their financial flexibility even more than previous generations of borrowers experienced. The psychological stress of carrying this debt burden extends far beyond just the monthly payment. It creates anxiety about financial security and limits young adults' willingness to take career risks or make major life changes. The debt service requirements also affect credit utilization and debt-to-income ratios, making it more difficult to qualify for mortgages or other forms of credit necessary for wealth building. But even if you could magically eliminate housing costs and student loan debt tomorrow, there's still a third factor that's systematically undermining the financial prospects of younger generations: wage stagnation. Here's a number that should make everyone furious. In 2014, the median compensation for a 30-year-old was $19.30 an hour. That's practically the same as it was for baby boomers in 1984 when adjusted for inflation, and more than $1 less than it was for Generation X workers in 2004. Let me repeat that because it's so important. 30-year-olds today make around the same amount of money as 30-year-olds made in 1984, despite the fact that they are 50% more likely to have finished college and work in an economy that is 70% more productive. This productivity wage gap represents one of the most significant economic injustices facing young workers today. The economy has become dramatically more productive over the past 40 years, but those productivity gains haven't translated into higher wages for workers. Instead, they've flowed primarily to capital owners and executives, creating a massive wealth transfer from workers to owners that has fundamentally altered the economic landscape. For millennials specifically, median incomes have risen only 8.3% from 2023 to 2025, while household expenditures increased by nearly 6%. That means real purchasing power has barely improved, and in many cases has actually declined when you account for the specific cost increases that disproportionately affect young adults. Meanwhile, Median wages for the youngest workers, those aged 16 to 24, have stayed, growing only about 1% annually since 2010. That's far below the growth rate needed to keep pace with inflation and living costs, let alone build wealth. The mathematical reality is stark. Young adults are earning essentially the same wages as previous generations while facing significantly higher costs for housing, education, healthcare, and other essential services. It's like being asked to run the same race that previous generations ran, but with weights tied to your ankles. And it's not just housing and student loans eating up these stagnant wages. Food prices alone have risen approximately 25% over just the past 4 years. Spending on car insurance for people 16 to 24 more than doubled between 2012 and 2022, while health insurance spending for that age group increased by 46% after adjusting for inflation. These increases in essential services create additional fixed costs that reduce young adults' financial flexibility and ability to save for major goals. Every category of basic living expenses has outpaced wage growth, creating a squeeze that leaves less and less room for the saving and investing that builds wealth over time. The result is a generation caught in what economists call a liquidity trap. They're earning enough to survive month to month, but not enough to get ahead. They're treading water financially instead of swimming toward shore. And unlike previous generations who could expect their earning power to grow substantially over time, young adults today face an economy where wage growth has become disconnected from productivity growth, education levels, and economic performance. This wage stagnation isn't happening in isolation. It's happening at the exact same time that the costs of wealth-building assets like homes have skyrocketed, creating a perfect storm that makes traditional pathways to financial security virtually impossible for millions of young Americans. The combination of these three factors creates a financial reality that previous generations simply never faced. Stagnant wages, exploding housing costs, and crushing student debt have created what economists call a triple squeeze that's fundamentally altered the economics of building wealth for younger Americans. But here's where the story gets even more concerning. And this is something that most financial experts completely ignore when they're telling young people to just budget better or work harder. The gig economy that emerged during Millennials and Gen Z's peak earning years has fundamentally changed the nature of work itself. 53% of Gen Z workers have a side hustle to help cover their monthly expenses, more than any other generation in history. Think about what that tells us. Traditional employment has become so inadequate that more than half of young workers need multiple income streams just to pay their bills. This isn't entrepreneurial ambition. This is survival. On average, millennials earn over $12,000 each year from freelance or side jobs. Workers with high-demand tech skills can earn an additional $45,000, while lower-skilled workers might bring home an extra $1,200 annually. While these additional earnings help bridge the gap between wages and living costs, they come at a massive cost to work-life balance, stress levels, and time for skill development or personal relationships. The gig economy, valued at over $500 billion and expected to nearly triple by 2032, has transformed the employment landscape in ways that create both opportunities and massive disadvantages for young workers. While gig work offers flexibility and income diversity, it comes without the benefits that previous generations took for granted. No health insurance, no retirement plans, no paid leave, no job security. Economic downturns hit gig and freelance workers disproportionately hard, creating income volatility that makes financial planning nearly impossible. A mortgage can't get when your income fluctuates wildly from month to month. You can't plan for retirement when you don't know what you'll earn next quarter. You can't build wealth when you're constantly worried about where your next paycheck is coming from. This shift from stable employment to gig work represents a massive transfer of risk from employers to individual workers. Previous generations could count on their employers to provide health insurance, retirement contributions, and steady income. Today's workers are expected to manage all of these responsibilities independently while earning wages that haven't kept pace with the cost of living. The result is a generation that's working more hours, juggling more responsibilities, and dealing with more financial stress than previous generations, while simultaneously having less economic security and fewer opportunities to build wealth. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this financial squeeze is how it's affecting the fundamental life choices and mental health of an entire generation. And this is where the true scope of this crisis becomes clear. 69% of Gen Z and millennials find long-term financial planning nearly impossible in today's economy. When you can't plan financially, you can't plan your life. You can't decide when to get married, when to have children, when to buy a home, or when to start a business. You're stuck in permanent reactive mode, responding to whatever financial crisis pops up next instead of proactively building the life you want. The psychological impact extends far beyond money. Gen Z is reporting higher rates of anxiety, depression, and distress than any other age group. The same research found that Gen Z was the least likely group to seek medical care for these conditions because behavioral health care is too expensive. This creates a vicious cycle where financial stress contributes to mental health problems. But the cost of addressing these problems creates additional financial stress. 25% of Gen Z points to mental health challenges as a major contributor to their sense of crisis, while 23% cite career struggles. For millennials, 27% are wrestling with the broader economic environment, and another 27% are dealing with mental health issues. The data shows that financial concerns are inextricably linked with overall life satisfaction and mental health outcomes. The emotional toll becomes visible in social media content where young adults express frustration and hopelessness about their economic prospects. Videos of people breaking down while explaining that they make 3 times the federal minimum wage but still can't afford to live have gone viral because they capture a reality that millions of young Americans are experiencing daily. This financial stress is forcing fundamental changes in how younger generations approach life itself. Over half of Gen Z and millennials receive financial assistance, primarily from parents or other family members. Nearly 24% of recent Gen Z and millennial homebuyers used family money for their down payment. This reliance on family support represents a fundamental shift in the pathway to financial independence. The typical down payment rose to about $63,000 in 2024. For young adults earning median wages while paying student loans and rent, accumulating that amount represents an almost insurmountable challenge without family assistance. This creates a two-tier system where young adults from wealthy families can access home ownership and wealth-building opportunities, while those from lower-income families remain permanently disadvantaged. Nearly 30% of young adults feels they don't make enough money to save. Only 15% of Gen Z puts a set percentage of their paycheck into a savings account each month. Just 1 in 5 contributes to a retirement account. The inability to save consistently creates a cycle where family support becomes essential for major financial milestones, fundamentally altering traditional patterns of financial independence. This dependence on family wealth for basic milestones like homeownership means that economic mobility is increasingly determined by family background rather than individual effort or achievement. The American dream of working your way up has been replaced by a system where your parents' financial situation largely determines your own economic prospects. The response to these impossible economic circumstances has been a fundamental shift in values and priorities that distinguishes younger generations from their predecessors. 60% of Gen Z and millennials are now prioritizing quality of life over accumulating savings. This isn't because they don't want financial security. It's because they've recognized that the traditional roadmaps to financial security no longer work. Many are prioritizing experiences like travel and personal development over traditional wealth markers, often delaying homeownership, marriage, and starting families. This shift reflects both a response to economic constraints and a different philosophical approach to life satisfaction when traditional become unmilestones have attainable. More than 1/3 of Gen Z identifies as having no religion. Less than one-third say they have a lot of trust in major institutions. About 1 in 5 believes the American dream is very much alive. With faith in traditional institutions fading, Gen Z is navigating what researchers call a choose-your-own-adventure economy, with increasingly high stakes. The decline in institutional trust reflects young adults' lived experience of institutions failing to provide the economic security and opportunity they provided to previous generations. When the systems that were supposed to help you build wealth instead saddle you with debt and price you out of homeownership, it makes sense that you'd lose faith in those systems. Some young adults are choosing flexibility over homeownership, opting to rent short-term, travel, or live with family. This preference represents both an adaptation to economic constraints and a rejection of traditional lifestyle expectations that no longer seem attainable or realistic. The employment market itself continues to present unique challenges that differ significantly from what previous generations experienced. The unemployment rate for those aged 20 to 24 climbed to over 8% by early 2024, while unemployment for prime-age workers rose only marginally. This disproportionate impact suggests structural problems in entry-level employment opportunities that go beyond cyclical economic fluctuations. Hiring rates in the private sector remain sluggish, comparable to conditions seen during the post-recession recovery of the early 2010s. That stagnation has particularly affected Gen Z, whose early career opportunities have been systematically constrained. 80% of Gen Z professionals in white-collar roles report difficulty finding better job prospects, forcing many to accept positions that don't align with their education, skills, or career goals. This challenging job market creates a cascading effect where young adults not only earn less than they expected, but also miss out on the career progression and skill development that would typically increase their earning potential over time. They're not just starting behind previous generations, they're falling further behind with each year that passes. So there you have it. The financial struggles facing millennials and Gen Z aren't about poor spending habits or lack of work ethic. They're the result of a perfect storm of economic changes that have fundamentally broken the traditional pathways to building wealth. Housing costs that have exploded beyond any reasonable relationship to wages. Student debt that traps young adults before they can even start building wealth. And wage stagnation that has disconnected earnings from productivity and education. These forces have created an economic reality that previous generations simply never faced, making it nearly impossible for younger Americans to achieve the same financial milestones their parents took for granted. Understanding this isn't about making excuses or giving up hope. It's about recognizing that the game has changed, and maybe it's time we started playing by new rules instead of pretending the old ones still work.